Michelle, Director of United States Studies here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here on this beautiful sunny day to see whether or not the left has a future. A burning question for many of us, has been for quite a while. We're very fortunate to have with us, well, let me just say this, this event comes out of the, conversations that were taking place among three of the scholars who are here at the Wilson Center this semester. Christopher Barrett, who's the Australia scholar, Stephen Kramer, who's a professor of grand strategy at the National Defense University and is a public policy scholar here this semester, and Roberto Toscano, who's a former ambassador from Italy to India and Iran, and who is also a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center. And they were having these ongoing conversations, and they drew me into them, and we decided that it would be good to go public with the conversation about whether or not the left has a future. And in order to get an American perspective, we invited Michael Kazin, who's a professor of history at Georgetown, to join us. I'm not going to go through their bios. You have them in front of you, but as you'll see, each of them is uniquely well qualified to discuss this question. They've done a lot of scholarly research on it. They've been involved in left politics one way or another for quite a long time. And what's really great is that they bring different perspectives from different historical and contemporary contexts to the question. This panel is very much in the spirit of the Wilson Center, which is, as you know, was founded as a living memorial to President Wilson. And in keeping with his life, the mission of the center is to bring together scholars and public policy makers. And in this case, we have a mixture of scholars and policymakers with us who will be addressing the question before us. Some of the questions that came up during the conversations that people were having and that we're going to try to address today include the following. Come on in. There are lots of, come close. There are lots of seats up front. Some of the questions that they're going to be addressing are: why is the left under siege in the United States and much of Europe and the Antipodes today? Why does it seem that the left has lost the war of ideas? How can it adapt to changing conditions? What would be the basis for its revival? But before they get to those questions about what is the current status and the future of the left, each of the speakers is going to also take a historical perspective and take us back to the origins of the left, kind of trace it forward, and then address this question about whether or not the left has a future. So we're going to go in the following order. Stephen Kramer is going to start out. He'll be followed by Michael Kazin, then Christopher Barrett, and finally Roberto Toscano. So each of them will have about 10 or 12 minutes to present their views, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming. I'll turn the mic over to Stephen Kramer.
Can I have a copy of the bios?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sonia. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to say that one of the great things about being at the Wilson Center is not only do you have a wonderful opportunity to pursue your own research, but you have terrific people around you. In this case, an old friend, Roberto Toscano, known for a long time but not seen very often, and a new friend, Chris Barrett. And because we're doing completely different kinds of research, but we all have an interest in the left, we've talked a lot about it, and we decided, well, maybe we could talk about it in public. And thanks to Sonia, who just jumped at this idea and who put it together. I mean, this is the kind of thing which makes the Wilson Center wonderful, great colleagues and a great administration. I wish I could be quite as optimistic about the future of the left as about the future of the Wilson Center. Well, be that as it may.
Hopefully the two are intertwined.
Not connected. In the last 250 years, there have been three lefts in the West. The first was the democratic left, the left of the Democratic Revolution, which sought to free men from the oppression of the altar and sword, from political and religious oppression in the name of the rights of man. It brought about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, revolutions of 1848, which by our time saw the end of dictatorship in Western Europe with the passing of Franco and Salazar. And You can say, if you want to use Marx's term, that the old mole of the revolution is still there, and he's now made it to North Africa and to the Middle East. So that's the first left. The second left was the left that sought economic and social change. It claimed that political democracy would be incomplete without social democracy. It challenged the gross inequality produced by the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and the new forms of oppression created by the rise of a new dominant class. Following the Great Depression and the international civil war of the 1930s and World War II, the non-communist left in Europe, other places, entered into a kind of great compromise with other political currents. In the age of the end of ideology, created a kind of new model for Western society, varied from country to country, an activist state, a state that engaged in economic planning, and a welfare state. The creation of the welfare state guaranteed that not that all would be equal, but that every citizen would have basic economic and social security. Emphasized economic and social security. And this was incredibly important because these people had seen what had happened in the 30s, where the lack of economic and social security during the Great Depression had spawned intense class conflicts, civil wars all over Europe, the rise of fascism, the growth of communism, ultimately the catastrophe of World War II. There were incredibly important political reasons to make sure that this would never happen again. And so this new framework is created. There was an expectation as well that a rising tide would raise all boats and that good public education would produce social mobility. And as a result, it seemed as if the social question in the West had pretty much been answered. That prosperity was assured. The non-communist left became parties of government, which it hadn't really been before the war mostly. And after a while, parties of government become parties of the status quo. And that's pretty much what happened to the European socialist movement. In the 1960s, a new kind of left arose, essentially a non-economic, non-materialist left. The left was associated with things like May 68, a revolution against conformism in a way, against the very structured lifestyle that the new post-war world had brought about. It was the generation of the Vietnam War, and many of you remember the kind of student movement against the Vietnam War. It was therefore a kind of anti-colonialist left. It was a left that tried to deal with the problems of racial inequality, because somehow or other in this country, the democratic revolution that occurred in 1776 had never quite included, African Americans. It discovered the importance of gender equality and ultimately of sexual diversity. It became aware of man's destruction of the environment, both living and inanimate, and which led us to understanding of climate change. The offspring of this left, largely young, upwardly mobile professionals, helped bring Barack Obama to the presidency. But there were basic problems, and there's the rub. The economic issues that the non-communist left had confidently believed had been settled in the decades following World War II, I think really believed had been settled, had really not been solved. And one of the reasons for that is that when Europeans and Americans thought about that post-war world, when I was a young scholar, and I studied the immediate post-war world in Europe, in France and Belgium and so on, had a chance to talk to many of the people who had been in the resistance, had been in governments in exile during the war. people like Mendes France and so on, they came up with this blueprint for what the post-war world will be like. And it never crossed their mind, I'm sure, that that world of modern society was going to extend beyond the developed nations of Western Europe, the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Didn't cross their mind that the third world, as it was then, was ever going to really become a great challenge to the West, that it would become a very modernizing, industrializing place. And consequently, if you had created social democracy in all the developed societies, you had pretty much an even playing field, then competition between those countries would never threaten the creation of a high standard of life. So the problem wasn't there. However, the problem is here because, of course, you've had this incredible change in the development of Asia, which has become a big source of competition. There was also very little sense of the impending demographic changes that would occur from incredible longevity and declining birth rates. The rise of Asia has led to calls for competitiveness. And competitiveness has become the battering ram to smash social acquis. Benefits, job security, the middle class status that large parts of the American public had gained, all that stuff was called into question, whether because it was necessary to compete or whether it was a convenient excuse for getting rid of these benefits. And this happened, of course, like in Italy, where even governments of the left have done their best to undermine, to get rid of the protections for workers who are younger workers. So the welfare state has been on the defensive since the 1970s. In the United States, neoliberalism seized control of the agenda, claiming to be a force of renewal. The neoliberal critique gained ground. There was a return to faith in the genius of the market, the invisible hands. The Reagan Revolution marked that. And many of the regulations of the Roosevelt era, which controlled financial institutions, were abandoned by liberal democratic administrations. In France, when Mitterrand was elected, the last party that major party in Europe that claimed to be socialist rather than social democratic, and I awaited naively, significant changes. It turned out that the great reforms they had in mind was some dumb ideas of nationalizing a few more industries, and there was an absolute bankruptcy in the part of French socialism. So that was the charge of the last guard, in a certain sense, of the European social democratic left. The Great Recession proved that economically, capitalism was a lot shakier than it seemed, but politically, it was a lot stronger. Governments saved capitalism, but they failed to reform it. Although the Great Recession was a crisis of capitalism, the right was as effective as it was cynical, was able to portray the welfare state as the crisis, regulation, too much regulation rather than too little. So, ironically, the left's failure to come up with good ideas to solve the economic crisis mirrored what happened in the 1930s, where the left didn't have a solution to the problems of the Great Depression, and that's what doomed, in many ways, German social democracy. What's amazing is how little our democratic administration has done to fight for ordinary people, to stand up to economic elites. People lose their jobs, their health insurance, and their houses, but there's no equivalent of the CCC, the WPA, which don't have to be historical curiosities. Sometimes it seemed in the last few years that the left consisted of the editorial board of the New York Times, one or two Nobel laureates, and a few people from the IMF. The left is demobilized and the unions have ceased to be meaningful. So the Democratic Party now acts like a party of the center-right, and the Republican Party like a party of the extreme right. So if I give me 2 more minutes, I will just try to answer the question. So where do we go from here? I wish I had great answers. First of all, it's absolutely crucial to my mind that any strategy of the left must be based on recalling one healthy idea from Marxism, one vital idea, and that is economic and political power are fused. Economic power matters. And that the United States, in fact, is in danger of becoming an oligarchy. But because the upper classes speak in politically correct terms of diversity, environmentalism, doesn't mean that, they're on our side. I don't think the class war is over, but it's a one-way war where the vast majority of the population is not defending itself. I think that we have to resist the push down of the middle classes. I think that the left needs a great idea. It needs a new paradigm, and it can't just be a defense of the welfare state. We have to focus more on how wealth is formulated and not just distributed in a way that will benefit all elements of society. Social solidarity is especially important because as downward mobility becomes greater, every man for himself is going to become a real threat. We somehow or other have to explain how our future is tied to the rest of the developing world. The Greeks talked about the aim of politics as being the good society, and the good society should still be the aim of the left. Thanks.
Good afternoon. One thing it doesn't say in my bio is that I'm co-editor of this magazine, Dissent, with Michael Walzer. We've been, you might say, worrying whether the left has a future since 1854. So longevity might mean something anyway. Thanks to Sonia for inviting me, and to the Wilson Center, where I spent a wonderful year way back in the Clinton administration writing about William Jennings Bryan. I'm going to talk about the United States in left history, the left history of the United States, and does the American left have a future? But of course, all these lefts are connected. We're way past the time when we can talk about American isolation from the rest of the world. But it's a little intimidating to I saw some very great historians in the room, great American historians, Alan Kraut, Ron Steele, Dorothy Ross, maybe others too. So I'm sure you'll correct me if I get anything wrong here. Well, obviously, as Sonia made clear, to respond to the question about whether the left has a future, in my case, the American left primarily begs the question of what the left has already accomplished, if anything. But first, what do we mean by the left? This itself is part of the problem, I think, at least in the United States. Actually, the term left was not widely used by people we now think of as leftists until the 1930s. When there were all these different groups on the left in Europe, and American leftists tried to find themselves within them. Before then, people we now consider leftists would have called themselves radicals, revolutionaries, or just socialists, communists, anarchists, et cetera. But the term left was seen as having a European provenance, and most Americans pretty much shunned it. But as conservatives have increasingly dominated the political discourse in this country, they have been successful at expanding the meaning of the term left to include just about everyone from Harry Reid to Noam Chomsky, and from the Democratic Party to the new Black Panther Party. Obviously, there's not too many points of agreement between these individuals and these groups. In fact, probably no contact between them, though it might be fun to have a debate between Harry Reid and Noam Chomsky. Maybe the Wilson Center can sponsor it. But the idea that they share something important often puts centrist liberals like Reid and President Obama on the defensive. If, after all, a lot of people think Obama might be a socialist, then where's the radical left in this? Is it invisible, or is everybody on the radical left? Well, I'll leave you to come up with your own answers there. And one of the problems here is that I would argue in the United States there's not really been a left movement since the 1970s, early 1970s, since the new left waned. That is a united left movement with united purposes, where people generally feel themselves part of something really large, which is moving forward, which has a vision of the future. There have been several large campaigns, anti-apartheid, solidarity with various radical regimes in Central America, for example, in the 1980s, the movement for gay rights, of course, with a lot of leftists at its core, but there really has not been a movement, I would say. There have been campaigns, but campaigns don't make a movement. And as a result, there's no agreed-on leaders of the left in the United States, and no agreed-on agenda either, which is a problem. But what about the past? Well, as everyone here knows, radicals in the United States have seldom mounted a serious challenge to those who held power either in the government or the economy. Only one third party on the left, the People's Party of the 1890s, had much electoral success, electing several senators, more than a score of congressmen at that time, and fusing with the Democratic Party in the election of 1896. But that success for the People's Party lasted for less than a decade. However, radical activists in this country played an essential part, really a critical part, in building a lot of reform movements that ended up changing laws in the United States and ended up really helping to create the reform eras in this country. During Woodrow Wilson's administration, especially the first one, during Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman's administrations, and then, of course, in the 1960s under John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Without radicals, we don't have at least the same kind of antitrust laws, black and women's suffrage, the Wagner Act, civil rights laws, Social Security, and the anti-poverty program. At the same time, to look at the success of the political left won't get you very far if you're thinking about the achievements of the left in America more generally. The fact that the American welfare state is fairly anemic compared to those that were built in Europe in the middle to late 20th century. The fact that socialist and even social democratic ideas were fairly weak compared to how strong they were, not just in Europe, but in many parts of Asia and Latin America, parts of Africa, shows, I think, that the left has been politically most successful when it has sort of been the caboose on the liberal train, as it were. But the left did have some real political influence, clearly, in the 30s, in the 60s, when it depended on mass aggressive institutions in which leftists were important organizers. The labor movement in the 30s and 1940s, and of course the movement for African American freedom in the 1950s and 60s. But obviously these institutions have withered quite markedly over the last 40 years. Any movement needs institutions, and without institutions, movements always wither. But the American left, I think, has one great and enduring victory. In a variety of ways, it has helped to transform America's moral culture, what you might call, in the Gramscian sense, to quote an Italian Marxist, the common sense of society. How Americans understand what is just and what is unjust in the conduct of public affairs, and at times, as with the feminist and gay movements, in private affairs as well. And that's not a small thing. To quote the British historian J.F.C. Harrison, the most enduring aspects of a social movement are not always its institutions, but the mental attitudes which inspire it and which are in turn generated by it. So without political power or honor as prophets, leftists still did much to make the United States a more humane society. By setting forth bold visions of a different present and a different future, they did a lot to initiate what have become common, if never uncontroversial, features of American life. These achievements include the advocacy of equal opportunity and equal treatment for women, ethnic and racial minorities, and for homosexuals more recently, the enjoyment of sexual pleasure unconnected to reproduction, a media and educational system sensitive to racial and gender oppression, and that celebrates what we now call multiculturalism, and the popularity of novels and films with a strongly altruistic and anti-authoritarian point of view. Now, most of these achievements involved what I call expanding the meaning of individual freedom and individual expressiveness. They did not, for the most part, except for the popularity of altruistic, populist kind of novels and films, really have much to do with the promotion of social solidarity, the basis, really, of social democratic and socialist ideals and social democratic and socialist governments in Europe and elsewhere. So, in many ways, the kind of sanctification of individual freedom that Americans have has helped the left to expand what that actually means. First for white men and onward to include African Americans, Latino Americans, gay Americans, women, disabled Americans, and others. The impact of what you might call cultural left activists, I think, has usually been more important than the impact of any political leader on the left. Think about the importance of Harry Beecher Stowe and Edward Bellamy, Max Eastman, editor of the Masses, John Steinbeck, Woody Guthrie, Betty Friedan, and Bob Dylan, at least in his early phases. All of whom had tremendous impact on American culture as leftists, with ideas derived from classics of leftist thought, both in the United States and in Europe. Compare their impact to that of, say, Eugene Debs or Earl Bradford, head of the Communist Party, or Tom Hayden in SDS. So what does all this mean for the future? Well, we obviously are living in a time of austerity, both here and in Europe. And in this time, I think Tony Judt, in one of his last books, was right to say that American liberals and radicals will have to act as conservatives. That is, we will have to defend what was gained in earlier periods of reform, from abortion rights to Medicare and Medicaid in their current form, to the right to collective bargaining. And this age could last for a while. There's an article in the Washington Post today, which many of you have probably seen, which talks about how, even in France, people are beginning to have to pay more for their medical care out of pocket. And of course here that is already true, and the left will have to spend a lot of time and a lot of effort basically defending what already exists, and to some degree what used to exist as well. But to get beyond that, that's of course the question. A conservative left is in some ways a contradiction in terms, or at least should be. Leftists will need to set forth, as in the past, a common set of grievances and a common vision. Once these grievances were slavery and the vision was racial equality. Then the grievance was opposition to corporate capitalism, especially the more monopolistic corporations, and the solution was industrial democracy. Once the grievance was the cruel system of Jim Crow and of institutional and personal sexism, and then the solutions were racial and gender justice and multiculturalism. Today, many people on the left point to the income gap between the richest Americans and the massive wage earners, and hope that this could unite a dispirited and often divided left. I hope the same, but it's going to take institutions that we don't yet have, and it's also going to take, I think, a cultural leap beyond how the left is perceived today, which, as Steve was mentioning, often the left is seen as people who teach history at colleges like Georgetown, where I teach, perhaps people on a few cities on each coast, where the rents are very high and so the costs of a good restaurant, and perhaps teachers' unions. The majority of Americans are, and will be for a while, white, wage earning Christians who don't live on either coast and who don't have a 4-year college education. And any left which is not able to talk about their grievances and give them a vision is not going to get very far beyond where it is now. Historically, I think it has taken a national crisis to give the left an opportunity to grow, to give the opportunity for the left to be a new left, to remake itself. From the sectional divide that divided antebellum America, that ended up in the Civil War, to the Great Depression of the 30s, to the confrontation between the black movement and racist officials during the Cold War. These are all crises in American life, crises in American history, crises that had a lot to do with what was happening elsewhere in the world as well. And it will probably take a similar crisis to revive the left again. I don't know what the crisis will look like, but I'm pretty sure one's going to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, and again, my thanks to Stephen for starting the conversation and for Sonia for making it happen today. I'm going to talk briefly at first about Australia for those of you in the room who aren't great experts on Australian political history, which I'm gathering would be most of you from the accents I've heard so far, and then some more general points and ideas for the future. To start out with Australia, there's two major political groupings in my country sustained by a preferential voting system producing a majoritarian lower house of parliament. We have proportional representation in the upper house and therefore a balance of power system there. The Australian Labor Party on the left and what we call the non-Labor parties, the Liberal Party and the National Party coalition on the right. In my former life, I was an advisor to the current Labor Party federal government, which was elected in 2007, at the end of 2007, and re-elected as a minority government last year. The previous federal government was Conservative under John Howard for 11 years, and then for 13 years prior to that, it was a Labor government under Bob Hawke and then Paul Keating. Labor is currently in power at the federal level. We're currently also in power in 5 of the 8 states and territories of the Commonwealth. So historically, this is a reasonably good position for Labor. in Australia, although unsurprisingly views on how good the precisely how good the position is differ at home. So I wanted to sort of start with that beginning point, use it as an example in the various comments that I'm called upon to make throughout, but also ask if this is a better position for the left, and I think that there is a nominally better position in Australia in terms of, if not size of government, then certainly Gini coefficients and the like, then why should it be better? And use that as the starting point to talk about some of the things that I think matter. Now, you would think that as a political advisor, former political advisor, I'd subscribe to the view that political outcomes are shaped by political leaders. I don't. In my experience, the more time you have in government, the more you start to believe that actually the institutions and the discourse are what really matters. And the view that large-scale political change is affected by political leaders alone is to use an American sporting analogy of which I've become fond, a sort of basically Hail Mary view of political change, that if only our leaders were more courageous or could throw or catch better, they would make this radical change that I want. But of course that's an essentially passive view of the public's role in political change. But secondly, I think it really ignores the powerful influence of institutions and the discourse. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and use Australia as a reference point. Institutions, of course, decide the breadth of the franchise and its political composition. For example, in Australia, we're unusual in having compulsory voting, which increases markedly the participation of disadvantaged voters in the country. Institutions also decide the organisational power of parties and political movements. For example, Australian elections have substantial, though far from majority, public funding and substantial caps and other restrictions on private funding. The strength of institutions like the union movement in Australia also lend organisational strength to the Labor Party in a number of ways that we can talk about. And I'd add that institutional reforms such as affirmative action policies within the Labor Party at least have been critical to increasing the representation of women within the party and the parliament more broadly, and it's a topic I know Sonia will bring us back to. But discourse also matters hugely. Politicians of the left and the right do not prosper by always governing from the margins of public opinion. It's risky, it's consumptive of scarce political capital. Leaders govern generally from the centre of the political discourse, shaded in each case by their ideological affiliation, whoever brought them to the dance, as Ronald Reagan said. Production and reproduction of that discourse, therefore, is really critical. And this depends on three things that I can think of, but I'm sure that people in the audience will add others. And we can think together of where the left has an advantage and where the right does across these three dimensions. The first is the resources to reach the political audience and how wide you can reach within the political audience. Secondly, the ability and creativity to adapt the political message to a changing world, keep it current and keep it appealing. And thirdly, the message discipline to ensure as much as possible one is fighting one's adversaries and not one's allies. Now, I think the left generally has the edge on the second of these, but I think it loses badly on the other two, and we can talk about that. So if we're going to come to talk about the future of the left, which is the purpose today, then I think I want to talk about institutions and the discourse. Institutions that will matter are the electoral system. Redistricting, for example, in this country is a bit of a mystery to those of us coming from Australia. You know, redistricting in my country is done by an independent body no one would dream of interfering with. Campaign finance, obviously to ensure the maximum participation of all voices, not just a few well-moneyed ones. Organised labour, this is always what American audiences find unusual, but it matters in our country, so I thought I would mention it. And there's no question that a lot of the economists who have studied the economic history of the recent period in the US conclude that organised labour is a big part of the story, the decline of organised labour, that is. And then on the discourse, I have increasingly come to the view that what matters is not just the political parties and not even the political parties in a lot of cases, but civil society groupings, third-party organisations. What you know in this country, of course, of is, Media Matters, Centre for Responsive Politics, Natural Resources Defence Council and the like. So I think that those organisations matter for the production of the discourse, at least as much as political parties do. I think it's important that we discuss those in discussing the future of the left. I'll probably leave it at that point. Might be a little shorter than the others, but happy to elaborate in questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Chris talked about institutions. I will not talk about institutions. Very modestly, I will try to ask two questions: what went wrong and what is to be done? Only. The fact is that you see here people coming from different countries and different professions, but we all agree about the fact that the left at present, globally, is in a disarray. And so maybe it's a good question to ask, where does this come from, historically speaking? I will start by saying something that probably will be surprising. I think the historical defeat of Soviet communism has a lot to do with it, even for those who not only were not communist, but who were anti-communist, but belonged to the progressive camp. Why is this so? For two reasons. In the first place, the right wing was very skillful in playing that card, meaning in presenting the defeat of Soviet communism as the defeat of the left as such, so much so that the use of the word socialism is a tool that is applied both to lukewarm social democrats and to communists. It's all socialism. So if the biggest historical example of a movement that claimed to be socialist is defeated, it means it has something deeply wrong. The premise was that any attempt at socialism would produce, as it actually did in the Soviet Union, both political tyranny and economic inefficiency. Les jeux sont faits, as they say in French. There is a second reason. The end of the communist challenge had a very profound impact because the Russian Revolution raised very momentous questions related to society, the class dimension of power, the problem of social justice, the issue of free education and social services for the masses, and then proceeded through the tragic decades of Soviet history to give largely false, demagogic, and merely ideologic, distorted answers to these very important and legitimate questions. Now, in the West, capitalism, facing that challenge, had to show a capacity for adaptation, which it does possess. And so the result of this were very innovative attempts to supply different answers to those questions. And social democracy is a different answer to those questions that were raised by the Soviet Union. And also the welfare state, which was not originated because of communism. Actually, it has a long history of late 19th century even, but it was accepted even by people whom we could consider conservative, because those things had to be addressed in a different way. Otherwise, the majority of the people would be very much tempted by that proposal. The end of communism, therefore, was very good riddance, but at the same time, it produced, let's say, negative results for progressives the world over. Because the fact is that maybe we can say that communism was very good for all those who had the fortune not to live under it. The proof is the aftermath. After communism collapsed, capitalism said, no more questions. The bottom line, society doesn't exist. The economy is idolatrically taken as the only dimension that really counts. And there is not much space for progressive and for leftist proposals if you take that as a premise. Let's talk about a second historical defeat, the 1960s. In the 1960s, the youth revolt, and particularly what we Europeans say, the 68, which for us was not anti-war, was something rather different. Young people raised the banner of a cultural revolt. It was not a revolution, it was a revolt. And it was centered on the rejection of what they perceived as being the essence of capitalism: austerity, sacrifice, repression in terms of personal lifestyles, puritanical attitudes, and so on and so forth. The slogans were power to imagination, it's forbidden to forbid, and so on. Little did they understand, maybe I should say little did we understand, the protean qualities of capitalism. Just as capitalism can be democratic or dictatorial, neoliberal or social democratic. It could also be austere or hedonistic. So that's how capitalism reacted to the youth challenge. Do you want sex, drugs, and rock and roll? I can supply them. And it did. It's enough to watch TV today or look at the consumption patterns of young people the world over. You know, that was a second very strong card against any sort of real, deep, radical desire to change. This brings us to a very important dimension of this discourse of the defeat of the left: culture. Progressive elites have tended historically to be hegemonic in the field of cultural production, so much so that the figure of the left-wing intellectual is proverbial the world over. The fact is that those left-wing intellectuals, though being an elite, were able to communicate with the masses, but because there were labor unions, and here is about institutions, because there were political parties that don't seem to be any longer around. Taking my country, the production of movies, of novels, of, in general, production in the cultural field, was not only by communist intellectuals, some of them were not communists, some of them were, you would call them generically social democratic or liberal, but they were able to communicate their message to mass audiences. This was basically either before or at the beginning of television as a mass phenomenon, because television introduced something totally different. With the advent, and here you will know I'm talking especially about my country, with the advent of an invasive, meretricious television, especially private TV, not coincidentally created by my present Prime Minister, those same masses were no longer exposed to the elitist but mass at the same time message of progressive intellectuals, but rather to a lot, and here I will reveal my prejudice, a lot of trash. Slapstick with half-naked girls and talk shows that resemble the normal work day of a gladiator in Nero's Rome. And the soap operas, don't forget the soap operas, which were really a success the world over. Like Beautiful, you know. And they shaped, or I would say misshaped, a generation of European, and not only European viewers, with its drooling over the irresistible charm of the rich and condoning their despicable morals. It's about hegemony, really, about hegemony of values. There is a paradox, though. Also the right, in practice, became more permissive. As was said by Kazin, there are certain things that have gone into general culture that were originally radical, but now are common sense. The paradox, and there is something that the left is not able to cope with, and not even to use in terms of polemic, is that this practice, permissive practice, does not prevent the right from using the old polemics against the left as being too libertarian, as being too permissive. You know, abortion and, you know, all those things. So practice and ideology are totally disconnected, but ideology still works. Incidentally, when the Soviet Union collapsed, somebody talked about the end of ideology, the end of one ideology. The other is thriving, the opposite one, I mean. Politicians who preach family values don't practice them. Well, I don't want to mention names, but you know. And in this country, we hear somebody like Newt Gingrich attacking, quote, a cultural elite trying to create a secularist America in which God is driven out of public life. This doesn't seem to me a description of what America is like, the most religious country where I've ever lived. A country where no politician who says he's not a believer stands any chance. And yet, still, the reality does not match with the rhetoric, which is something that the right is very good at handling. It's like, you know, they say that in Poland there is anti-Semitism without the Jews. So in this country there is anti-left without the left. Now, in ranking the motivations for human behavior, one can make a long list: greed, conformism, respect for authority, religious faith, whatever. But the most dramatic and the most effective one, and one that is used by the right, is fear. And what fear can be more compelling than the fear of terrorism? So 9/11 put another nail in the coffin of the left. Because the rationale for the existence of the state has shifted from even supplying services or regulating to defending your life from physical threat. So the welfare state has been replaced by the security state, by and large, in common perception. The state. Progressives do not believe, and the left does not believe, that the state should be everything. As a matter of fact, progressive thought can be defined as a focus on a permanent tension between state and civil society. A tension which guarantees a space for human freedom. All state, all powerful state, bad. Non-existent state, bad. And maybe even worse. Maybe you should go to Somalia to check. Since I have to conclude, let us also talk about not only superstructure, but also structure. What has happened? Well, many things have happened. For instance, inequality. CEO worker pay ratios have shot up from 40:1 to 400:1 in 20 years. The quality of public schools have deteriorated. Social mobility has dropped. The sharing of income between capital and labor on a national scale has become more lopsided than ever in favor of capital. This is why the points that I would just very briefly make, and maybe we can pick them up in the discussion about how to move from where we stand now, is paradoxically having as priorities something that the radical left has always thought as too reformist, too much, too weak, and too generic and not enough radical. What do I mean? Democracy. Because capitalism has proved that it can very well thrive even without democracy. So the left should say that there is not an option of progressive democracy and progressive non-democracy. Because there is a lot of enthusiasm for Chinese capitalism, communism, for instance. And this this enthusiasm is shared by people who claim democracy for Egypt or Iran. But China is okay because it's effective economically. So democracy is a non-optional dimension. Second, social mobility. Without social mobility, there is no chance for even mildly progressive formulas and programs. Legality. Legality, because capitalism is very much characterized these days, and you know in this country also, by scams, big-time frauds that are becoming more the rule than the exception. Legality, therefore, should be a banner of the left. It didn't used to be this way. As I said, legality, equality of opportunity, they sound very conservative. And here I agree that paradoxically today the left should sound conservative, because what we're talking about is not a lack of movement towards the future, but it's a regression towards the past. So let us defend democracy, legality, freedom of opportunity, which used to be conservative slogans, but which the conservative camp, by and large, is not putting as a priority these days. Because otherwise, the political arena will be monopolized on one side by plutocrats, you say that dirty word, versus populists. Because right now, those who oppose privilege and who oppose elites are not from the left. They are from the right, and they use anti-immigration, and I'm talking about Europe especially, but not only Europe. So if we want to have an alternative between, something more, I would say, civilized, we should try to find answers to the very, very basic question. Last point, ethics. Because the battle of the left can only be ethical, since the deepest core of being progressives is recognizing and caring about the other, the one who's weaker, the one who's different. Solidarity is the core of being progressive. And we should make it, from the left, much more explicit. And we should put it at the center of our political action. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure there are many questions, and we have plenty of time. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and identify yourself before speaking. This person right in the back with the white suit. Yeah. Yeah, please use the mic.
I'm Harold McDougall. I'm from Howard Law School. I was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee when I was a kid. One of the things that I'm interested in what people are talking about, I've heard folks say that intellectuals, left intellectuals have always had to use some kind of an institution to speak to the masses, like labor unions or what have you. And rightly observing that with respect to the civil rights movement and some of those movements at the time that I was part of, those institutions are gone. Are you familiar with study circles in Sweden? Anybody? Swedish study circles? Okay. Google it. The Swedes were at the bottom of the social and economic ladder at the end of the 19th century. And they were looking for a model for development. So they went all around, looking, and they wound up in some utopian socialist communities in upstate New York. And they discovered these study circles, about 15, 20 people, all kind of thinking about and reading about and studying the same thing. That's something that they were using to build civic infrastructure. They were having a lot of trouble in Sweden with labor discipline and alcoholism. So they started study circles for unions and for alcoholism, and now they have there's 15 or 16 study circle foundations that run discussions throughout the country all at a time. 2/3 of the Swedes over the age of 18 have participated in one of these things. The foundations that run the study circles are government parastatals. They are able to subsidize the study circles, but they can't tell them what to talk about. There's one for environmentalists, one for old people, young people, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, you name it. And one, if you don't belong to any of those other categories. The government only encouraged the study circles to discuss a policy matter once. I bring it to a close, yeah. And that was when they were debating whether or not to go into the common market. So 2/3 of the Swedes over the age of 18 discussed whether or not they were going to enter the common market. Now imagine having a discussion like that about whether or not you were going to go into Afghanistan or Iraq, something like that. Mm-hmm. So what I'm really interested in is the notion of these study circles, small groups of 15 to 20 people linked together, kind of all over the country as a piece of civic infrastructure through which the message could get out, but also which would discipline the left from engaging in the kind of elitism that has been its demise, I think, and I'm done.
Yeah, Roberto.
Yeah, I have a comment that I'm not familiar with this example, but my comment is about civil society. There are countries where you wouldn't believe that civil society was organized. For instance, here at the Wilson Center, I'm working on Iranian democracy. And Iranian civil society is extremely developed. But if you don't have a link to politics as such, it can only be a precursor of real change. I think those examples, and they exist also in Italy, are very promising, but the weakness of the left is not at the level of civil society. Today, it's at the level of politics.
A quick comment. I didn't know about those either, and they sound exciting. But I think, as we all know from our personal lives, in order to have a good discussion with somebody, you have to agree on something to start with. And I wonder whether, with the freak out about immigration, especially from Islamic countries, that's in Sweden, I know, and has affected the politics, as it has most countries in Europe, whether the study circles include people, who are from Muslim countries who are religious, as most Swedes are not. I'm trying to imagine what it would be like to try to set up study circles like that in this country. And of course, the first thing you have to figure out is, do I want to sit in a room with this person on a regular basis? And that's, Sweden, of course, is historically pretty homogeneous, ethnically and religiously too, when religion mattered to them. And so that's, I think, always a problem.
I would say that in terms of Sweden, in terms of politics, I mean, it's an amazing country because Sweden is...
Maybe you should talk more to the microphone.
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. I always think I'm talking too loudly. Sweden is an amazing country because in some ways it's the European country that discovered the welfare state. I mean, of all the countries in Europe, it's the one country that came up with the answer to the Depression in the 1930s. And Swedish social democracy sort of came up with this answer and perfected it after World War II, whereas most other countries, under the Nazi occupation, was a break. It's an amazing party. It's had really revolutionized the society. Basically, the non-socialist parties accepted most of the premises of social democracy. It had what Roberto was saying, kind of a hegemony intellectually and culturally. But even the case of Swedish social democracy, about 15 or 20 years ago, it sort of came to the end of having anything new to say, and had difficulty in dealing with the problems of the welfare state. And the result has been non-socialist coalition in power more often than not in the last 10 years, not doing anything drastically new, but certainly a slow movement in the opposite direction. And the Social Democrats have the same problem as the left everywhere else, of trying to figure out what did they really stand for, more than defense of what they had done.
If I could just intervene a little bit, I think the problem with Sweden is it's a victim of its own success. It succeeded so well in providing people with everything they thought they needed that they wanted more and more, and they wanted things to be more individualized. For example, in the case that I know best about childcare, they were so successful in providing childcare that people then thought, well, they should have longer hours, or they should have it more individualized or more to meet their liking, and that gave an opening for private childcare to come in. Stephen Shore, yeah, we're here. And then Detlef.
It has
Please
been,
identify yourself.
Oh, Stephen Shore. It has been said, and I'm inclined to agree with it, that the fundamental dividing line between left and right is the choice between individual liberty and equality, with the right, at least in American context, where the old arrangement of throne and altar has never really existed. So the individual liberty is traditionally supported by conservatives, equality by the liberals, or it passes for the left in the United States, given American exceptionalism. And yet it seems, even despite much tut-tutting over the lack of universal health care, of growing economic inequality, you hear people like Rush Limbaugh, who, whatever you may think of him, I personally think of him as a kind of American Hermann Goering, but nonetheless, the idea of redistributing wealth, that is, taking money that I've earned and giving it to them, has a very powerful negative resonance. And you could say, which is the chicken or the egg? Should the what left, or what its American parody thereof, come up with compelling values and then try to get elected, or recognize that the United States is inherently a conservative society, and so when the latest conservative administration is discredited, do you use your brief window, like a kind of the political equivalent of a solar eclipse? You know these are going to occur, but there never will be the norm, to push through legislation that will make you confirm your unpopularity, or do you basically stay in the center-right mode and in the hope of getting reelected and not daring to push forward any distinctive values?
Roberto, yeah.
I would like to recall here something very classic. Isaiah Berlin distinction between negative liberty and positive liberty. I think that in this country, the concept of negative liberty, which is of origin, is very much English. The privacy. Each man has a sphere that nobody should interfere with. Is extremely, extremely powerful. In other cultures, it's about positive liberty. So not freedom from, but freedom to participate, to influence society. I believe that the left cannot afford to drop neither of these two terms. Because if you focus only on negative liberty like in '68, you're doomed to defeat. But also if you only focus on positive liberty, meaning communism, which did not care about negative liberty at all, then also you go towards another kind of defeat, historical, moral, and everything. So it's extremely difficult to address this because according to different cultures, these two things have a different audience. I'm afraid that the American left has a big problem in convincing individuals here that negative liberty is not sufficient.
The other thing,
Yeah. Michael, and then
Oh, well,
we'll just go
yeah.
down the line. Yeah.
We'll all chime in. It's a good question. I can't resist quoting James Michael Curley, former mayor of Boston and governor of Massachusetts. He was supposed to have said, redistribution of the wealth would be very nice, but the most we can get in America is redistribution of the graft. And I don't know, Alan can tell you that he really said that or not. I'm not sure, but I love that line. Anyway, what? You should have, yes, like most lines. You know, I mean, the argument I was making, you know, in my little talk, and it's part of the argument I make in my History of the Left that's coming out this summer, is that, in fact, the left has been, you know, in many ways more effective at promoting what you could call negative liberty in some ways. That is, you know, pushing rights discourse, which is so hegemonic, you know, into spheres where Thomas Jefferson, James Madison did not expect it to go. I think it's fair to say. But at the same time, you can't build institutions like that. You know, institutions have to be built on a sense of solidarity, common interest, and so forth. And that's been something of a problem. And you know, in answer to your question about what should, you know, in this country liberals do when they get in power, is I think as much as they can do as possible. I mean, we don't want to veer off into a discussion of Obama probably, but clearly that's what Obama, with help from Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and other people, tried to do, you know, with exceptions, obviously, before the 2010 election, and obviously they didn't pay much attention to the discourse, I would argue. One of the reasons why they lost so badly in 2010 in the midterm election. But part of the problem there, too, was that there wasn't that much of a left to push them, you know. They were going on a sense of, oh, Americans have always wanted, you know, national health insurance in general terms, at least for a long time they have. So we'll give them national health insurance, but we have to make these compromises with insurance companies because there's not enough of a movement, hardly any movement at all, behind single payer. So you see what you got.
Just let me react to one of the points that you made, which is the question about should, you know, an opportunity be seized at some point, you know, newly after a government gets into power. I mean, the interesting thing, and I found myself thinking this at the end of Michael's piece, he said that it would probably require a crisis for the left to come together and act. Well, in fact, I mean, we did just have one. And
Didn't last long
enough. A more dramatic crisis for the neoliberal view of the organisation of economic affairs, one could not imagine, and hopefully we will never experience again in my lifetime, or anyone's lifetime here. And indeed, you know, the administration roused itself, I think, very quickly to act. But the legacy of what it had to overcome in terms of damage to the economy was just too extraordinary, and this country does have a limited tolerance for spending money and intervening economically in that case. I would recommend an excellent paper to you if you want to understand how other countries intervene, which is the one that I wrote about how we did it in Australia, which was, you know, I suppose, a reaction to crisis which actually did try and, you know, intervene and react, and with some degree of success. But I don't have a solution. I don't have a solution to that. But I just did want to make the point about crisis and windows of opportunity.
Could I just follow up with you a minute, Chris? I mean, what is it about Australian politics or political culture that makes that possible? It makes that kind of response possible.
Yeah, I mean, I ponder on this all the time. I mean, people, I've spent quite a bit of time in this country, and people always say, that Britain and the United States are two countries, divided by a common language, and I feel a similar thing. Whenever I come here, I know the UK well, I know this country well, I obviously know Australia well, and all Anglo-American societies, obviously, in terms of their economic organisation, relatively parsimonious welfare states, all of the rest of it. And yet, so many differences in terms of the reaction. Actually, look, the reaction, to be honest, in terms of the response to the financial crisis, the reaction in this country was not dissimilar to the size of reaction that there was in Australia. Not dissimilar in size, very dissimilar in speed, unfortunately, and that was partly a consequence of circumstances beyond the country's control. But the permission to continue acting, I think, was removed faster in this country. And there is just, people have down through the generations posited the reasons why this should be the case, but there is more trust in Australia in government, smaller country, managing a very large and inhospitable continent potentially has something to do with it. Beyond that, I'm in the realms of pop psychology, and I probably should stop. But that's my take.
Thanks. Stephen?
Well, I think that there's a kind of
You use the mic.
there's a kind of notion of American exceptionalism, a kind of dark myth that this country has never been amenable to left-of-center ideas. But if you were taking a look at the world, let's say from the middle of World War II, and ask, well, who had really done something exciting? Who had done something really impressive to deal with the Great Depression? I mean, you're left with Sweden and the United States. I mean, the New Deal was the center of policy making. Everybody looked around at what the Americans had done. The French Popular Front was supposed to be the French New Deal. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed. So at that point, at least, it didn't look as if we were somehow rather, incapable of major social reform. So the question is, what went wrong after that? And that's, I think, a big issue. And probably the Cold War and anti-communism, McCarthyism have a lot to do with it. And in terms of this crisis, I mean, what more do you want? Wasn't this one big enough? And so it seems to me that Neil Barofsky's op-ed that I'm sure all of you read, that at least for 24 hours, sent an electric shock into Washington, but shocks don't last for them, but for small spenders. I mean, I think part of that, so I think there was an opportunity, maybe that was lost, but it's also possible that that's wishful thinking on my part.
Can I just
yeah, go ahead.
Real quick point about the crisis question. It sounds like we're Marxist economists sitting around in the 1920s or something. But I think that this was a crisis, obviously, 2008 onward. In many ways, still is, obviously, for a lot of ordinary people who don't have jobs. But I think there are a couple things. First of all, to have an effective progressive left response to it, there has to be something, has to be a preconditions, there has to be preparation for that. And as people were saying, since the 60s, those preparations have been lagging. The discourse has been pretty much controlled by the right, so that Obama comes into a vacuum in many ways. You talk about community organizing. Well, community organizing is not, going to respond to the crisis of world capitalism. And the other thing is Obama comes into office in what the analogy to the 30s is if Franklin Roosevelt had been elected in 1930 instead of in 1932. That is, the crisis was still growing. Unemployment was still growing. It was going to grow. So it was almost impossible for Obama not to take responsibility, in a sense, for the recession. Whereas FDR was able to come in and say, didn't happen on my watch, and so he had something like a clean slate. Plus, there were a couple generations of progressive, left, populist, socialist, even discourse and institutions that had been built up before the 1930s, which Roosevelt could take advantage of. And some of those people actually ended up being in his administration, like Frances Perkins, the first woman Secretary of Labor, who had been a left social worker in New York and other places for 20 years before.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a minute. In the U.S., in the post-war period, labor was very strong, and labor did all it could to build up benefits for itself: paid vacations, health care, pensions and so forth. It did that for its own members, but it didn't. But it really kind of left Social Security to sort of lie dormant, and it didn't really push to expand Social Security. So as long as labor was strong, things were pretty good for its members, but not necessarily for everybody else. And instead of, I mean, what I'm wanting to get at is sort of a comparative question. What is the relationship between labor and left parties in other countries? And was it there? And now that labor is on its knees, then that, it's not, I mean, the Democratic Party takes it for granted, but it isn't really pushing the Democratic Party to the left at all. And of course, the people who depended on labor for their benefits are now really in big trouble, especially in terms of pensions. So, I mean, I guess it's a comparative question. And what is the coalition between, what does the relationship between left and labor have to be in order for that to work or not to work?
So, if I can respond on this first, because I think there's an interesting case study, probably of limited utility for this country, but maybe for others. The solution that was found when the Bob Hawke Labor government was elected in 1983 in Australia, which was after 8 years of a Conservative government that had abolished universal health care, which had been implemented by the previous government, and the Labor Party came back into power. Close relationship with the trade union movement, not uncomplicated relationship, but a close relationship nevertheless. And through a series of tripartite arrangements, well, not really tripartite arrangements, but government-union relationships, agreements called the Accords, Mark 1 through Mark, I can't remember how many. The agreement that was struck was wage restraint in return for what was called the social wage. And the social wage consisted in initially the reintroduction of universal health care, very substantial work on retirement incomes and substantially generous work on retirement incomes, family payments, childcare, and those kinds of things. And the union movement was able to uphold its end of the bargaining because you had centralised wage fixing, which we don't anymore. But it was able to manage wage restraint. And wages, actually real wages, went backwards for a lot of this period, but working people got universal health care, they got family payments, they got retirement benefits, and they got all of these things built up during the course of the 80s and 90s, and most of that infrastructure is still in place.
And that came through the state, not from your employer.
Yeah, correct. And some of it came from the employer, the retirement benefits, but most of it came from the state. So now, to what extent is that historical experience generalisable today? Probably not even generalisable today in Australian circumstances, but as a matter of historical experience, a very interesting relationship.
Roberto, yeah.
Labor in Italy used to be very strong, and now it's very weak. Why? First, it's an ideological phenomenon, protean capitalism winning over Soviet communism and anything that even vaguely and verbally resembled that, meaning the word socialism and so on. Capitalism is really cultural hegemonic now. Second reason was that Italian labor was very close to political parties. They are no longer around. And it was its strength and now its weakness because the parties collapsed and they also damaged the labor that was so closely linked with it. And third, well, here the devil has some reasons because it is true that labor has always defended, by definition, the people who carry a labor card. In Italy, for instance, what's glaring is that they protect retirees, should be in favor, of course, and they don't care about young people because retirees are labor, they still maintain their membership. Young people are out. So this is one of the reasons.
Just a little corrective, Sonia, to what you said about American labor. Certainly, there are examples of people already unionized in their unions saying, well, we'll just get a good healthcare plan and pensions from our companies and not push so hard. But with healthcare, that happened really after the defeat of national health insurance in the late 1940s, which labor did at first push very hard for. And in many ways, labor actually was very supportive of a lot of progressive measures which did not directly help labor. I mean, without the AFL-CIO, the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act would have had a very hard time getting passed. Same for Medicare. and Medicaid, which had a lot of opposition, obviously, from the AMA and other places, and conservatives across the board. And when Labor has tried to get labor law reformed, whether to defeat Taft-Hartley in the late 40s, which didn't happen, or more recently to pass the Employee Free Choice Act, they've almost always failed because they're seen as a special interest. So, perhaps that should be instructive for what Labor should do now. And I think even though what happened in Madison, Wisconsin is perhaps oversold, over ballyhooed. After all, they did lose. Probably, it's still in the courts, that law. Nevertheless, it's clear that for Labor to grow again, it's got to be perceived as more than people in unions. It's got to be perceived as someone was saying, in their comments before, a force for democracy at the workplace. It's got to be part of. It's got to be idealistic again, which it was in the beginning, after all. So I think that's one of the, not solution for Labor, but nevertheless a possible way forward.
Okay, let's see, Dieter, and then, have you given up? No, you haven't. Okay, and then we'll move over to this side. We have plenty of time, so I'll get to everybody.
Maybe take a few questions.
Why don't we take you and you? Okay, we'll take
great.
two.
Thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University, and also a German social democrat, if you want to, in the tradition of Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, just to make clear where I'm coming from. I wanted to get back to Roberto's notion of this global disarray of the left. And I have some trouble to accept that as such, because you might have a point, I think, if you make that argument on the level of institutions and individual parties and their weaknesses. Italy is one case, there are others. I don't think it is true on the level of values and what happened. And let me take some of your cases. You said the first defeat was 1989. 1989, Russian, the collapse of communism. Yes, the capitalism, get a bounce, and all that is true, and it led. By the way, the acceptance of capitalism happened already way before that by social democratic parties in Europe and elsewhere. So, but the point is this: I think what the East European countries that freed themselves and got rid of communism had, in terms of real values, was much more along the lines of social democracy. And I think Sonia is right with her injection to say, Scandinavian social democracy really suffered from its own success. And that's true for many European countries. I mean, Germany is one case too. In Germany, what you have is a hegemony of social democracy practiced even by the Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel. I mean, that's the point. That's the real thing that, even conservative parties took over some of classical left ideas and implemented them. Maggie Thatcher and her revolution. Look at Blair. Blair merged the two strands, and what didn't succeed was this radical form of saying there is no such thing as a society, there are only individuals. That is a point, I think, that did not succeed, and I think we have to see that. Your point about terrorism is good. I think that hurt the left more than the right, but it was something that, the left did not accept terrorism as a concept. I mean, that's certainly not true, and you had social democrats and left politicians who were just as forceful in their anti-terrorism strategy than the left. So I wouldn't accept that point. Now, but to the future question now, what we're concerned about, right? You all didn't talk about environmentalism, and I think that is, or from my perspective, not enough. And I wanted to ask you this really, I mean, isn't there something that the left should be working on more forceful and merge the original left values of democracy, equality, and protecting the weak? Yes, I would go that far and look around, that it works to some degree next door in Canada, the NPD all of a sudden, NDP all of a sudden seems to, come up. And so I see some better future, if you want to, if, you adopt and merge realities, dealing with realities, and classical left values. That's my point. Thank you.
Let's get responses to this, because this is
Yeah.
a big question. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I? I agree with you about Germany, but Germany is more like Sweden, where certain things have become common also to centrist, if not to the right. But in Eastern Europe, I think the jury is still out. Recently, Hungary has approved a clerical fascist constitution. Russia is not social democratic. It's a land of oligarchs. In Czechoslovakia, in former Czechoslovakia, in the Czech Republic, you have Václav Klaus, who is the quintessential neoliberal and has quite a following. Romania and Bulgaria, I don't think they can be considered social democrats. So Germany, I totally agree with you, of course. And as for terrorism, of course, the left has been even stronger against terrorism, but it's not perceived as such in many countries. They're soft because they say, let's apply the law. Let's not torture people. Ha, you're soft on terrorism because you don't want to torture them. So in Italy, the Red Brigades were defeated only because the Communist Party was strong, said no negotiation with them. Whereas certain people in the center and the right said, well, maybe in order to have peace, let's talk to them. So, of course, the left, the democratic left, is not soft on terrorism, but it is portrayed as such.
Stephen, yeah.
Dieter, I think that the idea that some social democrats are victims of success is true, but some of them are victims of failure. In fact, the main reason for the failure of some social democratic parties is that they're victim of failure. I think that good example of that is the French Socialist Party. I mean, a major party, after all. I mean, since Mitterrand, just sort of, where have they been? What exactly do they stand for? What's their position, ideological position? They've managed to come in behind Le Pen in 2002. They had an incredibly weak candidate. The war of factions continues. And the question really remains whether they will choose somebody who presumably should be able to win the next election or lose it. But they don't stand for anything very much. There's no vision of an alternative society in France. And there's, weak institutions, I think. I think that's true in most Latin countries. So, I mean, I think that your example is more of an exception than the norm.
Yep, here. Open.
Hi, Henry Farrell. I'm currently a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm normally at George Washington University. I've got a couple of questions, so I'll try to keep them as short as possible. For Mike, you already answered part of my question, which was I was going to ask about Wisconsin, what the strengths and the weaknesses were of that, whether this is a harbinger of something that could be useful, or whether it's just a flash in the pan. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And also, there was a very interesting piece by Benjamin Wallace Wells, which quoted you today on Paul Krugman as a sort of basically portraying Paul Krugman as a kind of leader in exile of the American left, and you as someone who is somewhat critical of him. So I was wondering what you see as Krugman's vision, what you think your differences are from that. And I guess for Roberto and for Stephen, on Italy, I'm not sure that one can blame it on culture and Berlusconi quite as much as your narrative, at least here, suggests. So if you look at the Italian left, we had two governments in 96, 98, 2006, 2008, which were led by the left and which were pretty disastrous. So I think there's a story to be told there, which is in some ways about institutions. Certainly, I know this is Prodi's analysis of it, that one of the things that is important here is the way in which both the Italian party system and Berlusconi's clever manipulations of electoral law helped produce this weakness and fragmentation of parties. So I was wondering if that's something which I think is something think, which is significant. And more generally, for both you and Stephen, I think it's hard to talk about the problems of the European left without thinking a little bit about the both the opportunities and the very real restrictions which are posed by the European Union. And here I think is if you look at the European Union, especially after Maastricht, and especially what we've seen unfolding over the last year, we really see a space in which it isn't anywhere near as congenial to the left as many people, I think, thought back in the 1990s. We do see a space where sort of very clearly free market principles, which are often very good principles, are enshrined, where the sort of European Central Bank has a vigorously has a vigorous policy of inflation targeting, and where we see more and more moves towards institutionalized austerity on the European level. And so one of my real worries is what kind of a left can we have arising on the national level within Europe, where on the one hand, at least for Eurozone countries, you have these countries sort of more and more restricted in the kinds of sort of the policies they can offer, sort of labour market policies, other kinds of sort of spending, sort of basically a very, very little ability to maintain this over the longer term. And also on the other hand, we see how the kinds of political tensions which are being created by the Eurozone are leading to a resurgence of the right in places such as Finland, to a kind of a know-nothing centre-rightism in Germany, and I think more generally to a feeling that a retreat from a more internationalist, more solidaristic view of the world into one which is basically a view of we have ours, sort of to hell with the rest of the guys, and that's obviously not to mention countries such as Ireland and other places where which are really feeling this in a very strong way, and which I think are vulnerable perhaps to to a different form of right-wing authoritarianism springing up over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, well, Henry, you've given us a lot to think about. Michael, why don't you start?
Yeah, and I want to try to be brief because I think we're half an hour or something. A lot of people have questions, and some people are already leaving. So, but I'm not involved directly in labor movements. I'm not sure what their plans are, how to make hay out of this. I know there's talk about it. The SEIU is starting some national campaign, which sounds a lot like what Working America does, which is this AFL-CIO sort of house-to-house group, which tries to bring the message of the labor movement to people who are not members of the labor movement, and that's all very important. I think in the center of this, what's going on here, and this should give the labor left an opportunity, is the whole question of public schools and teachers. Again, on Dissent, we've been running several articles about these issues, and we'll continue to run more because I think, it goes to competitiveness, it goes to questions about cultural capital, it goes to questions about class, which are connected to cultural capital and everything else. And I think teachers are in many ways right in the center of this, and of course they're not supposed to stand up for themselves as political people, but of course they are, and the unions, and there's this huge attempt to separate the unions from the teachers, as if we're talking about two different animals, and somehow. But I think this does give labor generally, and the teachers union specifically, an opportunity to sort of repackage themselves. I hate to use that term, but because they were in the center of mobilizing people in Wisconsin. I know that for a fact. I mean, it was nice to have all the other public workers too, but the teachers were central to that. So that's one aspect there. Krugman, well, I haven't seen the article yet, though. That reporter did interview me. About Krugman, I think as an historian, he's a good economist. As a political analyst, he's a good economist. I love the fact he's on the right wing, so to speak, of the right side of the op-ed page, a couple times a week. And I agree with him at probably 99% about what he says about economics, though you expect me to. But my problem with him is, and this is true of a lot of people on the left, unfortunately, today, is when they think about conservatives, they tend to be reductionist. They tend to think conservatives really only are all like they're like the hero in Fountainhead. I mean, they only care about their own greed and getting more and punishing the poor. And that's a stereotype. I know a lot of conservatives, and of course, I study conservatism as other folks do. And conservatives would not have. It's axiomatic to me that conservatives would not have become a mass movement if they were only about greed, if they're only about taking from the poor to give to the rich. And that's some extent a caricature of what Krugman says, but not that much, especially in his book, which came out a few years ago, about history of America and the virtues of liberalism, as he called them. So, you know, that's my problem. You know, if he's the leader of the left, he shouldn't be, but he's certainly important.
Yeah, Roberto.
Well, when there is a defeat, it's not only because there is a devious and cunning adversary. There is something in the defeated that explains it. So I agree with you in your description of the left, of the Italian left. It was a problem of electoral law and fragmentation of political parties, so much so that Prodi could be toppled and was toppled by somebody having less than 4% of the national vote. That was part of it. But he was also toppled because the left, the real one, the radical left, didn't like him. He was too moderate for their taste. And now, of course, they should be crying. I hope they are crying, because the disaster of Prodi's collapse is with us today. European Union, that's a very important angle of the situation. Now, the problem is that the European Union is blamed at the same time for being dirigiste and for being too much for capitalist. As you know, the reason why, for instance, in the referenda in Europe, they were defeated, it was because both the right and the left, in economic terms, were against Europe. So there must be something there about the political message that Europe is sending out. In Italy, there has always been a federalist left. But in order to have a federalist left, you should show a momentum which is not there now. You know, enlargement has replaced deepening, And enlargement by itself is not thrilling for any federalist political movement. So now, for the first time, Italians who used to be 90% for Europe are 65% for Europe. And this is also a factor, and it's another factor for the right. One little snide comment on what Michael said: the real trick is for the rich to convince the poor that they should vote against their own interests. Somebody succeeds in that.
Stephen, yeah.
Well, first point, Italy and France. The problem with the left is that, you know, somehow or other, I wish I could make the analogy to the planetary system. What you normally would have in the place of the left is a big planet. But instead what you have is a sort of medium-sized planet with a lot of asteroids. And the power of attraction of that planet isn't great enough to draw on those asteroids in and form one kind of unit. That's really not. Well, the point is that in France, what happened in 2002? You have the plural left. And these guys all thought on the first ballot they could vote for whomever they wanted because they knew that Le Pen would not come in first or second because it didn't happen. So they all went and did because they didn't really like the candidate of the left that much, of the socialists that much, but he was going to be the inevitable candidate, so might as well point out they didn't like him very much. So he didn't get enough votes and Le Pen came in second. If there were a powerful socialist party that had a real attraction, that meant something, some of these crazy outfits of Trotskyists and extreme leftists and Besançon, the postman from somewhere, they wouldn't be getting 7 or 8% of the vote. You know, and Chevènement wouldn't have gotten all those. They would have been, it never would have happened that way. But it happens because that party hasn't managed to present a strong image. And it's a problem of fragmentation that goes back to the 19th century. In Italy, it's the same thing. I mean, the left is really divided into many, many small groups, and that allows this crazy reconstructionist communist to brought down Prodi. So you need if that ended, you'd have a much more competitive left. In terms of the right, we're always surprised at the strength of the right. And the reason that happens is that we forget that the European right has been there for 150 years. It's always there. It's always there. Think back to the days of the 1880s in France, the Boulanger affair, the Dreyfus affair. These guys and some of the same slogans go back to the 1880s, France for the French and all that. You know, I mean, whatever the Front National was saying, that was saying. But the thing is about this far right, it doesn't. It has its highs and its lows. In times of economic prosperity, it sort of disappears. In times of adversity, then it becomes very strong, and so it disappears, and you sort of think it's not there for a while, and then, or you have something like World War II, which sort of discredited the far right for a while. Then it comes back. So what's happened now is, you know, it's come back big because of the economic recession and all the problems of the euro crisis. So it's a great moment for the far right. But it's not on the level of the 30s, and so these parties seem to be containable unless something went really wrong. In terms of the EU, the problem for the left is, I mean, imagine that your goal was taking power, in the EU. Let's say the left in Europe decided wanted to take power by democratic means in the EU. That's a meaningless phrase because there's only one body that's elected, the European Parliament, and no one really thinks that the European Parliament, if the left dominated it, which once had as the largest party, that would give it power in Europe. All the other positions are appointed positions. So there is no European politics in a normal sense, which means the left can't be competitive, which means that you have lefts on a national level like any other party and that have some real meaning, but it's no longer the same meaning as they had 50 years ago. And then you have the left, which is very diffuse in the European Union and can't govern it. So it's a very, very difficult situation, I think, for the left or for any other political movement. It's just not normal politics.
I realize we didn't answer Dieter's question about environmentalism, and it's a very important question and a tough one because, I mean, the golden age, what Eric Hobsbawm and others call the golden age of social democracy, from late 1940s to early 1970s, of course, was also the time when environmentalism began to grow as a movement, but it was a period of tremendous growth. And the left, to the degree that the democratic left has been successful, I think it's almost always been in times of growth. It always has a problem when there's not times of growth. So obviously, to have environmentalism become a real mass movement of more than sort of the upper middle class and in societies, people who are willing to give up some things, there has to be a change in the culture. And I wish there were a Green Party in this country, which meant something besides helping George W. Bush to get elected. But I think that's that's certainly something in terms of vision that the left has to work on. But again, most people are going to want growth in the short run over doing something about global warming, which they're not sure what that really means.
Yeah, I'm going to gather a couple of questions. This gentleman right here, and then the one in the back. Yeah, this Linda Graysuit. Yeah.
With the exception of a brief remark by Professor Kramer and Ambassador Toscano, no one has mentioned the impact on either the local left or the global left of the rise of India and China in the global economy. I would think that, for example, as a former IBM employee, I look at IBM's globalization both as a good and bad thing, as an American, as an IBMer. And I was wondering if you have any comments about what globalization does to the left.
Okay, and then the gentleman back there. Yeah.
I'm Greg Squires from George Washington University. A crisis and paradigm question. I think it's important to keep in mind that there are millions more families that will lose their homes due to foreclosure, and the fact that there are fewer, bigger banks left standing hardly means that this crisis is past. A couple of you have mentioned that the left needs an alternative paradigm to the welfare state, and I'd like to hear a little more concretely what that means, and more importantly, once we have it, how do we sell it?
Okay, two meaty questions. India, China, globalization.
Good start.
Yeah, you go ahead.
I will just take the globalization question. The left, even the moderate left that believes that in the market plus some sort of welfare and regulation needs a nation state that is relevant. And globalization has made the nation state much less relevant. So there is no politics at the global level. There is no democracy at the global level. So what kind of buttons do you push in order to pursue progressive programs at the global level? This is the big question.
But international business is international and global, So there's the paradox. The left is based on the nation state. Business is international. In the era of globalization, the left is in difficult shape.
Chris, yeah.
But no
It did, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's say the left often talked internationalism, but what how do you go about doing that? what are the global institutions, what are the political institutions on a global level? They don't exist. And so even in the European Union, it's very, very difficult to exercise political authority on a European level because then there's really not much in the way of institutions. If you had Europe as a truly federal state, with federal politics, with federal parties, with elected federal offices, if in fact Europe, a federal Europe was like, well, the United States, where Brussels was Washington, then of course the left and everybody else would be able to compete in a real politics, but that doesn't exist.
Chris, yeah.
Yeah, just responding to the question up the back about the new paradigm and how to sell it. I always feel very boring when I answer this question, but I don't believe that there is a new paradigm. I believe that there's an existing paradigm which works perfectly, which can work perfectly well. I mean, the things that got us into the most recent economic crisis, the things that continue to hurt us, to hurt real working people and not just working people today, and the things that can get us out of it are not new things. They're not. It's not terribly hard to come up with the solutions, and there are policy instruments that would have worked, that did work, where they were implemented, and they're not terribly glamorous or different or new or exciting either. The difficulty has been, if you like, the authorising environment and the political fashion of those ideas. The political fashion of appropriate financial regulations, the political fashion of appropriate responses to economic decline, and the political fashion of all of these things, which had become over a period of time quite politically unfashionable. So I don't think it's a matter of necessarily inventing new things for the sake of it. I think it's a matter of understanding what many generations of economic and political experimentation have taught us are a lot of the right answers to these questions, particularly in preventing crises and responding to them when they've happened. But actually finding a way to sell what we already know and ensuring that when ideologies or political fashions are proven to have a crisis moment like they did in the most recent crisis, that they're made to pay the price of that crisis moment, that blame is apportioned appropriately, not for the sake of apportioning blame, but for the sake of learning the lessons.
You know, I'm struck more and more what I've read about the ideology or the desires of people who go on strike in China, for example, today, and as well as the intellectuals there who often are seem to be punished more than the strikers do for interesting reasons, and what's happening in the Middle East, and the success of the PT in Brazil, and there's a different kind, somewhat different kind of left, obviously in Venezuela and Bolivia. We haven't talked about Latin America either. That in some ways, you know, I'm being perhaps too optimistic here, and we're not a very optimistic panel today, but in some ways, you know, if you could take a poll of people in all these countries and say, well, basically, what do you want? You know, what kind of society do you want? I think most people would say a society which protects, you know, civil liberties, which involves some measure of democracy, some measure of being able to elect your leaders and hold them accountable, and what we call in this country a social safety net, which is, you know, pretty firm and secure and obviously affordable. And this seems to me to be the historic demands of the left, the Erfurt program, 1891 in some ways. You know, they went a little beyond that, but nevertheless. So in some ways, you know, it goes to what Christopher is saying. I mean, the goals aren't new. And, you know, if these could be articulated, I think, you know, again, being overly optimistic, you know, most people in the world are social democrats. And unfortunately, there's a lot of things in between that vision and having a way of selling it.
Yeah, let's Alan, and then we'll work our way back down. We'll take two questions.
Alan Crowd, American University. My question is about the people who are engaged in the passion for reform. If you look at the United States in the 1930s and 40s, a lot of the intellectual thought, a lot of the organizational skills, a lot of the passion for the program of the left came out of Eastern European Jews, out of Southern Italians, out of the immigrant populations of this country. And I'm wondering where you envision it would come from today. And I'm also interested in whether or not you see the immigrant populations that are often the poorest populations and the ones in greatest need and are part of a global movement, if you will, of peoples across the face of the earth, if this could be the origin in any way, shape, or form of a revivified left in the same way that it was the heart and soul of the left in the United States in an earlier period.
Okay, and is there, yeah, back there. Yeah.
Good question. Roy Culpepper, Wilson Center. I'm wondering if we're not giving enough weight to the issue of growing inequality. Roberto mentioned it in his remarks, but more as something to be lamented rather than a critical weakness of society as we know it today. Many people would ascribe the crisis or the roots of the crisis to growing inequality in this country and in other OECD countries, which has increasingly forced lower income people into positions of unsustainable debt. So it's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the left, because ultimately, I don't know how many people are familiar with the book that was published a year or two ago by the two UK epidemiologists, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level, Why Growing Inequality is Bad for Everyone. It seems to me that if those kinds of arguments are taken more seriously, in other words, that greater equality, that doesn't mean the same income for everyone, but less inequality is actually good for a healthy society. The incidence of crime and other kinds of social ills is actually highly correlated with increasing inequality. So what does this mean in terms of sort of practical policies? They do tend to be boring, but they're essentially very important. They concern things like active labor market policies, because ultimately you want economic growth to translate not just into jobs, but into good jobs, quality jobs, not low-income hamburger flipping types of jobs. But this requires an active labor market policy, and it does require a certain amount of redistribution. But if the left can convince that elites and everyone, that this is in everyone's interest, then it seems to me this is politically far less challenging. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to take the Jill and this woman here too, these last two, and then those will be the last questions.
Jill Shankelman, and it follows on a little bit from the last comment. Roberto, you gave your sort of suggestion of 3 ideas, one of which was social mobility, and I'd really welcome some more comment from the panel as to what it seems to me that is one of the organizing arguments that could motivate and mobilize left thinking, particularly in the United States, and I'd welcome some more comment from the panel about that.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Morse. I'm a grad student in the history program at American University. And my question was, I really liked what you had to say, Christopher, about organizations and discourse having more power than we think they do. And if any of you have any comments on how to, I guess similar to what you were saying, how to mobilize, how we in universities, how we students can mobilize and more students, because from what me and my friend Nuit here have seen, I think it's there it's there in the undercurrents, but there needs to be more motivation. So thank you.
Great. Okay, as you respond to these questions, we'll just go right down the panel. Please finally address the question, what is to be done? Stephen.
The question of, that you asked about immigrants. Now, I ask myself the question all the time, what happened to the Jews?
Rich.
Simply because my own personal background, I think of what the Jews represented in my parents' generation, City College, all that, even in my generation of the anti-Vietnam. Well, I don't know what's happening now. I don't see it. So I think that's a really interesting question, and I'd like to understand it better myself. At some point, I really have to try to understand it better.
Do you think the issue of Israel is somewhat divisive on that?
Yeah, but I mean, the question is, and it goes back to your question too. I mean, where's political passion among young people? Now, it's very difficult when you're a teacher to know, because it's very difficult in many cases to talk to students in a normal way. My problem is,
how do you talk to them?
No,
in an abnormal way. using a Tweety voice.
My problem is I have 40-year-old students at National Defense University. So, and where I do teach, undergraduates or younger graduate students, it's as an adjunct, and so it's not a situation where you really can get to know them. So I don't know, but I sense a lot less political passion than I would have expected, especially given the tough times that students have, because they're being really screwed up. There are no jobs. There's nothing. And I would expect a very radicalized kind of student body, and I don't see that. And so I'm puzzled and like to know why better. Yeah. Would you want to?
Well, I think a few reasons probably that I see. I think a lot of our energy is taken up or sucked into the internet, and we think we're doing things through Facebook. Emails and Facebook pages don't have the same power as riots and demonstrations and stuff like that, obviously. But a lot of energy is taken up by that. And I think another thing is, in the 60s, it seemed like, I was talking to my professor, if you know Dr. Kuznick, Peter Kuznick, about this, and he said, in the 60s we had an idea to begin with that this is the way things were supposed to be. And then when we saw they were different, it horrified us, and we wanted to change it. But now all of us have, in our generation, we've grown up with, well, we're all going to, this country is going down, down the drain, so it seems very hopeless. Like, what's the point of even trying?
You believe that? Is that a common idea, that the country is going downhill? That therefore your opportunities are not very good?
Not that the opportunities aren't good, but we're powerless to change. Powerless.
Yeah.
Because the people who are running it down the drain know exactly what they're doing. And you guys tried to whip them in shape in the 60s, and it didn't work. And it's on its way.
Yeah.
Some of it worked.
Some of it worked. Yeah. Let us not forget the women's movement. Okay, Roberto.
Yeah. Well, these questions were so good that maybe we should stay here another hour. Inequality. Definitely, the issue of inequality should be central to any progressive politics. If it's not, that's one of the problems of the left, of course. It is a critical weakness. But let me link this up with the first question about who can be the driving force, the people, the social group demanding change because they need it. Well, two groups were mentioned. One, the disaffected youth. But the problem with young people is that they have been kept, I'm talking about my country, but I think in other countries too, they've been kept away from any sort of power, not even power, but capacity to influence things by the previous generations. The previous generation have done a great job in preventing young people from moving up in the political groups and parties. It's amazing. In my country, it's really very extreme. And also, they are maybe socially active, but they are politically illiterate, not because of their fault, because they didn't find the template against which to judge society and to propose something different. The immigrants, I'm talking about not immigrants in this country, I'm talking about immigrants in Europe. Well, political activity on the part of the right wing is focused on keeping the immigrants out, not only physically, but since we need them, let's admit them so that they can work, but let's keep them out of politics. Immigrants in my country and in other countries in Europe are really not participating. Last but not least, social mobility. Free education, good quality free education. This is what we had in my country from 45 to 75, and to a certain extent even now, but less than before. And I can assure you, if you have good quality, free education, you will have social mobility.
Just responding to a couple of points, I just wanted to respond very quickly to Roy's point. I agree absolutely, and in fact I had written down all of the Gini coefficients of the various countries that we are talking about on the panel today. It will not surprise you to hear that the United States has the worst and getting worse, that Italy's is pretty bad. You're about 25 out of the 30 countries in the OECD. And Australia is middle of the pack, 16 out of 30. Ours is getting marginally better. But the interesting question, I think, also, Roy, and people will correct me if I'm wrong, but generally it has been my observation that that governments can shift Gini coefficients, can shift inequality, and do. And it does shift. Progressive governments do generally manage to improve it somewhat. The UK is a good example in this table. It gets worse under the Conservatives and got better under Labor. And of course, what's going to happen now? Brazil, and my country as well. So that's just to say that I do think it's possible, and I think it should be a central aim. Finally, let me come to the question of activism and the sort of the advice that you're looking for. I detected, the emergence of a sort of a baby boom generation YZ split in some of these conversations. It's good that the conversation's happening. I feel like I can be an independent arbiter because I'm from that hopeless generation X contingent right in the middle, but I can be a bit of an independent arbiter in these things. It strikes me that there's nothing to say that there's no law of nature that says political idealism is distributed differently among generations, but the numbers are distributed differently. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the last great upheaval in terms of political reform in the 60s came with a demographic bulge of the baby boomers coming of age. And the point is that this generation now does actually have numbers on its side. Not only does it have numbers on its side, but I heard what you said about the internet, and I'm probably the last person to ask on these things because all of that Facebook stuff has passed me by, and you would probably say that this is a good thing. But it strikes me, though, that a lot of our politics, even though politicians are on Facebook and Twitter and all of those kinds of things, it strikes me that a lot of the uses of this technology, the beneficial uses of this technology for retail politics and for community organising and third sector organising, have not really yet been harnessed. That if people are just working out when they're going to meet up at the movies, that's not the right usage of it. But we seem to be running at the moment our politics on our 21st century politics on sort of 20th century hardware and software, and it's time to work out how. Now you're better placed to decide that than I am, how that is done, but I think it can be. One suggestion that I would make, what I noticed, particularly being in the practice of politics and dealing with retail politics day to day, far too few interactions between people within politics, and I mean just at the representative level, but also at the staff level and the bureaucratic level. Far too few interactions between them and the third sector societies who are trying to influence them. So it's not just about the public campaigns, but it's also about building the relationships with the people who are in the rooms making the decisions. So if I had one useful suggestion, that's it.
A lot of things on the table, but which is always true when you talk about the left. Well, first, there's still a lot of left-wing Jews. I mean, after all, and liberal too. I mean, Jews are one of the only ethnic groups in American society that consistently votes against its class interests. That is, you almost always vote for Democrats, and Bernie Madoff's side, and that's quite remarkable if you think about it. And I mean, I won't go over the number of well-known left voices who were Jewish. Some on the far left, like Naomi Klein, the late Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, and many liberals, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's the head of the new DNC. Not a surprise that she's a Jewish woman. But I won't continue on that. But there's I think the tradition has not been broken, I think, of activism at all. Though, of course, the Workmen's Circle is not a very lively institution anymore. But on the question of immigrants too, I'm actually more hopeful there. there's an interesting, I've done some reading about the DREAM Act, the coalition behind the DREAM Act, which didn't succeed, but it's quite a broad coalition, as well as the coalition behind immigrant reform more generally. It includes a lot of people in the Catholic Church who are not on the left and on issues, of course, of abortion, if you consider that a right-left issue. But they certainly are on this issue. And I think as people in this country are not going away, they're not going to go back to Mexico or to Guatemala or El Salvador or other places. And a lot of people come from those countries have left traditions. That's true of Salvadorians, especially in this area, among other areas. And some of the strongest trade unionists in this country are, in fact, immigrants from Central and Latin America. And finally, the question of where the new left is going to come from. I think that, think how optimistic people were about the Obama campaign, when it was going on. I mean, there was a huge number of people. I remember at Falls Church, where I was working out of every weekend for about 7 weekends. At the end, you had to stand in line. You had to take a number as if you were in a delicatessen in Manhattan to actually make phone calls for Obama. And most of those people were young. Not all of them. Many were my age, but many were young. And it was quite astonishing. What if after the election, people said, well, we're not going to just step back and wait for Obama to do things. We're actually going to continue to mobilize, continue to be in groups. And what would have happened? I mean, of course, it didn't happen for the most part, but nevertheless, the potential was there. And I think we shouldn't act as if, oh my God, the left has been losing. I mean, Obama's campaign was not the left, but certainly a lot of people, had left ideas who were in it and thought that it was going to promote a new progressive era. And we'll just end with a success of the left on my own campus, the Georgetown. There's a group called Georgetown Solidarity Committee, which helped the cafeteria workers to organize over the last year very carefully. They got faculty on their side. They got the administration on their side. They worked one-on-one with cafeteria workers. And by the end, they got 85% of the cards signed to get a union there. And it was impossible for the corporation, Aramark, which is a very big corporation in America, which services a lot of campuses, to oppose them. So they got what's called card check, recognition of the union. And, in that sense, it was quite heartening to see this kind of worker-student alliance, as we used to call it in the 60s, that was really, and most of those workers were African-American and Latino workers, mostly immigrants. So, if it can happen, in Georgetown, it can happen at AU as well, similar kinds of things. As Joe Hill said, don't mourn, organize, but do it intelligently.
Well, thank you so much to our audience for all these wonderful questions. I know the panelists appreciated it and really made for a very lively discussion. And thank you, of course, to the panelists for their provocative remarks. Thank you. I think the left does have a future, at least if we keep talking about it. So thank you very much.